Welcome to the Bipartisan Policy Center. We're here today with Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President, and Steve Bell, Senior Advisor, who both happen to be former Senate Budget Committee staff directors. So you can guess what we're going to talk about, the new budget deal that was just announced in the Senate. So let's start off, since it's the Bipartisan Policy Center. Is this truly a bipartisan deal? Why don't you take that, Bill?
No, it's truly a bipartisan deal. There are a number of provisions in here that Democrats wanted. There are a number of provisions in here that Republicans wanted, in terms particularly as it relates to increasing the caps for defense. To get the increase in spending for defense, they had to give to the Democrats an increase in spending for the non-defense. Then there are a number of provisions in here that relate to health care that CHIP, which was a bipartisan, extending it for 10 years. And there's a number of provisions. This is truly a bipartisan agreement. We'll have some more comments about what that means from a fiscal policy perspective, but it is truly a bipartisan agreement in the Senate at this point.
Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, it's bipartisan. It shows you that if you're willing to spend enough money on enough people for enough of their causes, that you can actually get a bill passed. It's sort of like what Warren Buffett said about the tax bill. If Republicans can't pass a tax bill, then what good are they? And so in this case, the Senate said, what do you need? We got a little provision on in there for example, for the farm bill, for our friend from Vermont, Mr. Leahy. We have other things in that 650 pages that we'll discover probably over the next year or two. But everybody is really happy, and I expect it to pass by a large margin in the Senate.
So what do you like about the provisions in this? We have to note it's a draft at the moment. Yes.
There are two or three things I think that this bill does that are good. One, it gets rid of, for at least 2 years, and I hope forever, the ill-conceived so-called sequester or Budget Control Act caps, which have been an absolute disaster and which have not led to any decline really in deficits. So we've had the caps and deficits have gone up. Number two, it sets some precedent for kind of clearing the decks of these continuing resolutions and a possibility that you could get to regular order and other things besides spending and taxes could come up someday in the United States Senate. And number three, it does address the opioid crisis. It does address the emergency spending for the result of the hurricanes and the fires. So if you look at it from that point of view, it does attend to some important things.
How about you, Bill? What do you like about this piece of legislation?
Well, I think what Steve mentioned, particularly as it relates to the funding for the disasters and for Puerto Rico and for Texas and Florida and Louisiana, the states that were devastated by the disasters, along with California for the fires. There was $80 billion or so in this particular that's been languishing since last fall, quite frankly, and well overdue. And that should have been done. That should have been done automatically. It didn't need a budget agreement to get to that, but it's in there, so that's good. We finally got to it. And I would also agree that the fact that we should not have another government shutdown now. That once this now we do have another continuing resolution that's going to take us to March, so it's not really completely finished here. We still have to fill in the details to fill up those up to the cap levels. And the last thing, I guess I agree, and I think it's a good deal. We had a major threat coming in March, which was not a government shutdown, but a government default. Not being able to pay our bills. And this one puts off that. It takes care of that until well past the election. In fact, a year from now, March of 2019, we won't have to worry about a government default. Those are things that generally I like in the bill.
And so let's switch to the other side. What don't you like about the bill?
I think this is a disaster as it relates to fiscal policy. Yes, as Steve says, and when Republicans and Democrats get together, they can agree on one thing, apparently, is that we can increase spending. But they haven't done anything as it relates to the deficit. They haven't paid for this in any way. Once again, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have increased defense spending. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't deal with the funding for opioids and infrastructure. By the way, I would say, Steve, that the down payment on opioids is very small. It's almost like $6 billion.
Right.
And then they say there's infrastructure in here. It's $20 billion. Come on, the president's already asked for $1 trillion. So we're a long way with even this bill. Go out and claim that we've done something for opioids and infrastructure. We haven't done anything relate to that. But having said that, yes, there needs to be resources expended there. The problem is that we haven't done anything as it relates to the real drivers to our spending in this country, and that has to do with the entitlement programs. And listen, let's be honest about it. These are things that politically are very risky for Republicans and Democrats to take on, particularly in a mid-session year for an election coming up on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. The major entitlement programs are the real problems here, and they basically just ignore completely anything to do with funding. This in combination, not that I'm opposed to tax cuts, but this in combination with a tax bill that added $1.5 trillion to that, we are really creating a terrible situation for future generations going on and imposing a tremendous burden of debt in the future. The fastest growing component of the federal budget will be just paying the interest on the public debt as a result of this, as interest rates are now going up.
How about you, Steve? What don't you like about it?
I think the last point is so critical. This is a fiscal disaster. It once again shows what the late Pete Domenici and others like him once said in a cloakroom to a senator who was being very proud of a black book he had put together with all sorts of spending restraint, except no reform of Social Security, no reform of Medicare, no reform of other pensions. In other words, the 3/4, or at least 70% of the budget, including interest payments, that were causing the problem weren't touched. And so Domenici in front of me said, I think that's a chicken thing you're doing. And the senator, what do you mean? And Domenici said, I'd be a lot more impressed if you were really taking on the drivers of what is causing our fiscal imbalance and our fiscal follies. 2 weeks later, that same senator came back and told Domenici, you're right. And he added an entire section about entitlement spending. Well, the president has said several times, I'm not going to touch entitlements, goodness gracious. I'll be out of office before Medicare collapses, so it'll be on somebody else's watch. He hasn't said that part, but that's what he implies. And most of the people who are making this deal right now will be out of office 7, 8, 10 years ago when we have to address Medicare. So once again, what they have done is taken a little tiny bit of the budget, about a third, and the slowest growing part of the budget, and they've focused on that and said, aren't we good boys? The deficit hawks will come up, sort of like Lazarus risen from the dead, and say, oh, golly, I care about deficits now, after having voted for huge defense increases, huge increases in the deficit because of tax cuts during a recovery, if you can imagine that. And all of a sudden we'll have these people who say, well, I can't vote for this because it increases deficit. And you say to them, sir, are you willing to take on, or ma'am, are you willing to take on what's really driving the deficit? Oh, goodness, no, don't talk about that. And so I think this really shows, once again, the fundamental hypocrisy of both sides on the issues that really are causing the problem.
So what are the next steps, Bill?
Well, first of all, it has not passed the Senate as we speak here. I assume it will pass the Senate. It is a bipartisan agreement, as we said. There will be some Republicans that won't vote for it. There will be some Democrats that won't vote for it. So first of all, it will pass the Senate. It goes to the House. This is different than what the House sent over to the Senate a few weeks last week. So we'll see what the House does. My guess is that it will eventually pass the House and go to the President, and he will sign it. And we'll be off to the races, and we will then proceed with, interestingly, people keep saying, well, no government shutdown. I understand, but we've only set the dollar amounts. We haven't filled in the account levels, and it's going to be a lot of work between now and March the 24th to fill in the details. That requires passing specific appropriation bills to reflect the total amount that they have to work with. They'll have to work pretty hard to get everything done. Again, pass House, Senate to the President for appropriation bills. So they've got a lot of work ahead of them just now to carry out this, quite frankly, a blueprint for how much we should be spending for fiscal 18 and fiscal 19. One other thing I should say, Toby, as we get into this a little bit more is what I'm concerned about. By setting the level of spending for fiscal year 18, which is the fiscal year we're already 5 months into, and we'll not get the appropriations done until in March at the earliest, but also setting the level for fiscal year 19. The President's supposed to submit his budget for that fiscal year next Monday. and I think he will. It'll be interesting to see if his budget reflects these caps that were just agreed, that if that becomes law. But what I'm worried about from old budget committee perspective, what you've just done is basically said there's no need for a budget this year. We can just forget it. We won't have to talk about entitlements. We won't have to talk about Social Security. We won't have to talk in an election year. We've already taken care of it. So we will once again go through this process, and we will not do what really needs to be done, which is a bipartisan budget resolution that brings Republicans and Democrats together to focus on these major issues that Steve has outlined.
Well, I think Bill makes the critical point here. In 1974, that is in the memory of most people not alive now, we did something important. What we said to President Nixon, what the Congress said, and Bill and I were around then, was this: we're not going to just depend on you and your Office of Management and Budget and your assumptions and your economics anymore. We're going to establish a process here in Congress where we have our own estimators called the Congressional Budget Office, where we have our own access to information, where we make our own decisions about where money should go, because the Constitution says that's the Congress's prerogative. Spending shall not occur in the absence of an appropriation, the Constitution says. And so what we are seeing now is the self-destructive behavior of Congress saying, I don't trust CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, anymore. I don't want to use their economics. I really don't want to be bound by anybody, so just can you be quiet about deficits and projections and stuff? And I'll just go ahead and use the president's assumptions because it's just too hard for me. We are seeing an abdication of really constitutional responsibility here. Can't do appropriation at a time? Bill is absolutely right. I'd bet $1 to a donut right now that we will not have a budget resolution passed by Congress for fiscal year 19. Think about that. The basic responsibility that Congress took away from the executive in 1974 and under the Constitution a couple of hundred years ago, they now are saying, oh, never mind. That is the full abdication of its responsibility under Article 1 of the Constitution. So I guess for somebody like me, I sound very old and archaic when I talk about Title or Article 1 and all that stuff. But you know, a lot of people over the last 45 years, names that are famous in this town and elsewhere, have spent their entire careers asserting Congress's role as the Constitution outlined it. And now we have, in the space of about 3 or 4 years, led by a president who probably hasn't read the Constitution, we have had this abdication of responsibility.
Is there anything else you both would like to add?
I'm happy that we are not going to have a government shutdown. I'm happy there are these green shoots of bipartisanship breaking out this on Capitol Hill. I wish it went further than just adding to the deficit. I wish it went to bipartisan, which to take on the serious challenges going forward. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening anytime soon.
I agree with that. I think we've now set a new high standard for spending and deficits. And we're not going to go back down. And unless we have another, some sort of epiphany like we did back in '83 and we resolved Social Security for a while. But I think about the people from the John Chafees and the Pete Domenechis and the Howard Bakers and the Bob Packwoods and Bob Doles who really risked their political careers fighting for fiscal prudence. And now they're gone now. And I really look back on at least 40 years of my career and say, I don't think I solved this budget problem like I told my late mother I would.
Aww. And on that note, thank you for joining us at the Bipartisan Policy Center.